Record this session. Pay attention. If the recording for any reason basically pauses or stops, let me know. The purpose of this meeting is to help you with the process of your ethnography. Like everything else, your work has been disrupted. And definitely what is called classic ethnography is a supreme impossibility because we don't have the possibility of hand-on or direct observations. Again, I should say we are fortunate to be able to use what is called virtual or digital technology or ethnography, if you will. This is the second time I taught the same course in the summer, and all students actually were using on a website of some sort, and they were looking at socialization. Again, I'm using the term socialization within a particular paradigm, within sociolinguistic orientation or linguistic anthropology, if I should be more precise. And socialization is primarily the process of acquiring the cultural capital, symbols, competencies, and skills. Now, the title of the course should not catch you off guard. You don't have to observe a particular cultural phenomenon. You could primarily look at the intersection of education, language, and culture in a very broad way. So for instance, if you have that kind of meaning of socialization in mind, you would focus on typical activities or a typical activity which is recurrent, which is routine, which is mundane, which is totally uninteresting. And then you explore that within the microcosm of the culture of the classroom, whatever it is. So do not really pose a question that addresses cultural diversity of the classroom or how the culture of the students or the teacher would inform or shape the practices. Obviously, these are pertinent and questions that we have to look at, but given the time constraints that we have, you cannot really focus on evaluative questions. So your question should really be more the question of how something is done, how certain skills or competencies are acquired, how teaching and learning takes place. Now, if you have a broad perspective and focus on typical activities, then you should be fine. I'm not saying that you cannot sharpen your focus, but ethnography, as you will find out today, and some of you have already begun reading the ethnographic eye, is more the question of a written account of a culture. And in this particular context, culture has variations. It is cultural diversity. You are observing different, basically, sites, and obviously each site would have its own subculture to begin with. So with that introduction, I would argue that ethnography is really flexible. And ethnography has evolved with the technology, a technology that initially only used note-taking, and then audio recording came along, video recording, and then camcorders came along, and definitely now we have technologies such as Zoom or Skype, where you would be able to capture human, really face-to-face interaction, more or less directly, even though there are technical problems. But at least you have a sense what human communication is all about, whether it is spoken or whatever form basically it takes. What I'm trying to say is we are using really the same technology when it comes to digital ethnography, but our ability to use these technologies would really depend on consent forms that we have to receive from the communities that we are going to be observing, rather than doing the work secretly. Not rather than, as a matter of fact, you are not allowed to. So, meaning if you have the ability to access the recorded sessions of a website, a classroom or not. If you are able to audio record, if you are able to, for instance, videotape, all these would depend on the site and your ability to seek and gain permission. Initially, I told you that you should avoid bureaucratic institutions because you don't have time. You only are going to do 4 observations, and this is not really research in the real sense of the word. This is a classroom assignment, and it is crucial for those of you who are going into teaching, not that this ethnography teaches you how to teach. It is much broader, but definitely those of you, and quite a few if you are going into teaching, this could be a very beneficial course. And for those who live in a multicultural, multilingual society, again, this course, whatever your major is really indispensable to learning how to appreciate the cultural diversity. So with that introduction in mind, what I want to focus on today would be the classic ethnography, and I would mention where digital ethnography could also be used and what forms basically it could take. I will talk about the tools that you need. As a matter of fact, the tools that you need now, not that it is available to everyone. Unfortunately, we are not on campus, but we do have an Anthro and a Ling lab where you could borrow camcorders, digital audio recorders. You could have received help with the conversion of your data, so on and so forth. But I would say that if you are lucky, rich enough to have a cell phone, you have all this technology on your cell phone, which would be more than sufficient for the purpose of this class. So I'll talk about the tools that you need, and since you are working on your first observation, I will touch upon the first observation, the purpose of the first observation. We will do the second workshop on the second observation. Keep in mind, you're not going to wait for us if you are fortunate to have access to your site a second time, a third time. Feel free to observe. The second observation is a misnomer. I have to change it. It is less intimidating, but when you write your second observation, it could be based on more than 2 observations. So again, I'm going to follow the process that we have in the ethnographic project process, which is on Beachboard. So if you recall, it began with the site description that most of you have done this, and I have read and given you comments on. Definitely you have to familiarize yourself with the protocol of that place. It is Zoom, but digital technology has its own protocols that we need to learn and need how to follow. And that is very important, even though we may take it for granted. in addition to that, you have to plan your work. It does not happen instantaneously. It is not planned by you. And that makes it more challenging. You have to really be in touch with the website, the person in charge, so that you are guided through the process. But you should not expect anything beyond the fact that you try not to be intrusive, and it is really a favor that they have done to you, and you should be able to do your work as non-intrusively as possible. Any questions? So the second session, as I was saying, I will concentrate on the second observation and developing a research question. Let me open the PowerPoint.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So if we, okay, so for example, I chose a recreation center from the park. What if we can't get in touch with the person? Can we just like find information on the website instead with the person? Because I think they're closed.
So they are closed.
Yeah, because it's in the park. So I was wondering if I could just get the information from the park, from the website, and just like find videos of the recreation center and just like kind of like go by that and not by like a person because I don't think they're open.
Right. It could be an institutional authority. It is fine as long as you could basically observe. Even if it is not the person directly in charge, but definitely in places such as the one that you're describing, then you have someone who is directly in charge and then someone, a higher authority. In which case, basically, you need the permission from both. But if you are given assurances and you have tried to contact the person in charge without much success, and you are allowed to observe, I would do this, given the fact that some institutional authority has given you the permission.
Okay, thank you.
But you have to know what that institutional authority represents and how it functions. These may not be related areas. I couldn't tell. What is important is what we do is legal and ethical. So it has to be really both. I don't want you to get into trouble and your work right in the middle be halted for not following the required protocols. So while you are waiting for that ultimate consent or permission from the person in charge, you should not give up, because people get endless emails or inquiries. You just have to make your case known. So I wouldn't give up. And see if the person who is in charge of the park is influential enough to contact the person that you're looking for on your behalf. So anyway, this has to do with seeking basically informed consent. Luckily, you don't have to deal with IRB, human subject. It's really a very complicated process. Okay, so do you see my screen?
Yes.
I mean the PowerPoint. So let me talk about ethnography. Ethnography is essentially a written description of social organization, material resources, and symbolic systems that a community uses. So it is a written report of a culture. And it comes from the word ethno, meaning people, graphy, writing about a people or a culture. The methods that are used are qualitative. They're systematic observations and participation in the lived experiences of a community. In reading Winckelmann, you probably came across the term emic and etic perspectives. These are significant in ethnography. Emic perspective is the perspective of the community, the insider, the so-called natives. And the etic is the perspective of the observer, the outsider, if you will. Now, different ethnographers approach the emic and etic differently, but the fact of the matter is, reality is somewhere in between. As Duranty basically argues, you really are trying to be so close to the natives or the community members to be able to represent their views, or you may be a member of that community yourself in some cases, and yet you have to be able to detach yourself enough to represent their lived experiences so that you could represent whatever you are observing objectively. And this requires a multivocal capacity, including the group studied, the ethnographer's voice, and the voices of other ethnographers. In the case of preschool and three cultures that you're going to be reading, for instance, you will see this at play. Even though it is not a typical ethnography. Why? Because every preschool was visited once or twice. As a matter of fact, the ethnographers went back after about 18, 20 years and visited the same school. And they added another school, but their observations were short, really spanned. But in a way, they triangulate their findings by interviewing not only members of the same culture, teachers, preschool administrators, but by going, for instance, to Americans and inquiring about what they think about the Japanese or the Chinese and vice versa, by taking the videos, snapshots, and showing it to them. So in a way, they try to use what is called multivocal ethnography in essence. Now, this is important in ethnography because we really depend on mostly qualitative research. I'm not saying that quantitative research cannot complement it, but triangulation is a way to enhance the validity and the reliability of the data. So now that you have found a site, you're wondering, what am I going to be focusing on? So the problem is anything and everything would qualify. How a community organizes its life through different activities, diversity as a form of cultural expression, what people do, what they use, tools that they use, texts that they use, how they use them, what they know and think, how they ask questions. For instance, you have been reading No Bedtime Stories. It is a very good example of the ways in which three American communities, meaning main town, middle class, white, Roadville, working class, still white, and Tracton, working class, black community. They are not too far away from one another, but they have different communicative practices and literacy experiences and events. So Heath, for instance, doesn't travel to a remote place in the world, and in the United States finds significant cultural differences. And she spends actually more than 5 years to identify why, for instance, African-American kids abysmally fail. This is a sad story. This was done decades ago, but it's still really relevant in the sense that literacy, for instance, as a consequence of differences in communicative practices vary greatly, not only in terms of basically asking questions, how to ask questions, what types of questions to ask. All these would have implications, academic and, if you will, professional implications for the children in their future when they attend school. So for instance, Maintown kids did extremely well, Roadville did well up to the 3rd grade, and Tracton children did very poorly throughout the whole process. So, you know, that was a relevant question. Why were Tracton children failing? And the response that the ethnographer found, it was because they were not ready for school. They were not ready for the types of questions, for instance, that they were asking. She attributed schooling performance to differences in culture. So how they treat the written word. You remember Shakespeare in the Bush, you know, the thieves, they were not familiar with the written word. They were actually shocked to find out that Bohannon was telling a story from a book. They were just saying, give me a break, for God's sake. Well, that's not how a story is made, constructed, or told. They were surprised. They were familiar with the written word. It was just dowry and taxes. That was the only domains in which they had seen writing. How they view misbehavior, for instance, in the Japanese context, there is a kid who misbehaves, if you recall, and the teacher does not interfere based on the Japanese culture, and they let basically the kids work out what the problem is. So that is definitely a domain. How they talk or not talk to children, going back to lowering your child into this world. You know, those mothers are really like American mothers. They constantly talk to the children, and they think that the children are talking back to them. They eventually talk back, literally speaking. But that is not universal. Talking to the children and for the children. That is something that ethnographers could do. So questions related to power, who controls whom, who does what, all these would be definitely, would qualify as possible questions. Do you have any questions before I move on to the next one?
Professor, seeing as how we're going to be doing our focus in now a modern setting. So like I'm going to be observing one of my Zoom classes on teaching.
Yes.
How do I look at it with an ethnographic eye when it's all modern, you know, it's all my culture I'm studying, essentially. Do you know what I mean?
So your question specifically is, I'm trying to know what your question is, how to adapt your basically site to this, or to adapt what?
Well, I mean, I'm not looking essentially at another culture. I'm looking at American students in a classroom. So
right. Yeah, that's fine. That's what I initially said. I said, you know, don't look for something unusual. We are interested in the most routine, the most mundane aspects of basically what takes place. It doesn't have to be a foreign, exotic, you know, culturally diverse class, even though cultural diversity exists, especially in a place such as Los Angeles. Your question really doesn't deal with specifically or directly with the cultural dimension, even though everything is informed by that unconsciously to a great extent. So could I ask you what your site is again?
Mine is my introduction to education class. So maybe I should focus on teacher-student interactions, or maybe the stories from some of the students on their upbringings or things like that.
Right. I mean, sometimes we may be premature in deciding what our focus is, and I can't blame you because of time constraints. I mean, a very broad question is, what are these students socialized into, right? What is the content of this course? What is the function of this course? Now, the personal stories or narratives of the students themselves could have ramifications for the socialization. That is one of the ways in which these students are being socialized into the content of the course. Do you see what I'm saying? And right now, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to socialize you into ethnography to the extent that basically I know about ethnography, and I've done ethnography myself. So classrooms are not homogeneous. Cultures are not homogeneous. Even within the same culture, you can find great heterogeneity. So do not look for culture as if, oh, it is something, that you could see. To give you an example, when I did my ethnography in an Iranian American heritage school, I found it quite boring, tedious, uninspiring. And yeah, kids were sitting there copying the letters of the Persian alphabet for half an hour, for 1 hour. And I remembered my own childhood, and what else could be more frightening than a childhood that I had, for instance. It was copying. And I hated it, especially when the teacher would just cross out whatever I wrote. One day it dawned upon me that, oh, this has cultural and educational value. If your handwriting in that culture sucks, you're good for nothing. So you may write something correctly, but if it is not written elegantly and attractively, teachers would reject it. That day, I found out, I was just looking at something happening right before my eyes. I had experienced it myself, but didn't realize the cultural significance of handwriting in that culture. So I decided, what am I going to focus on? How Iranian American children are socialized into elegant handwriting. There is a word for it. It's a cultural term called khoshnevisi, which literally means elegant handwriting, which is different from calligraphy, by the way, which is a Greek term.
You're helping me because that's the presentation I'm going to be doing, the Iranian graphic one. So what I've noticed in my classroom is a lot of socioeconomic diversity going on, and a lot of stories of how their education was affected by where they lived. Could I maybe do a focus on that? Would that be a good idea?
I wouldn't go beyond the classroom. I mean, you could always interview people and ask them those questions. Focus on something.
Stories that they're volunteering in the classroom.
Yeah, definitely you could. You could interview them, but given the pandemic, you can't really do any community work. I mean, literally going to their community and finding about their lives, so on and so forth. But you could definitely look at the role, the socializing role of these agents or these volunteers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so ethnographic methods, primarily you have already started, you have contacted the person or the person's in charge. If not, obviously you want to tell them what your association is and what it is that you're going to be doing, not specifically because you really don't know. And as I said, it is important to seek and receive consent. And it is required, whether explicitly or implicitly. So with children, it is far more complicated. So you have to really try to avoid children. If they are old enough, they probably need consent. You need to familiarize yourself with the site. It is not an actual site, but it is important to know what the pattern is. What happens, for instance? What are the typical activities? If it is in the open, if it is through a Zoom session, if it happens in a physical, basically, space. It is important to build rapport. These days, it is more difficult with the informants. And obviously, you know, it takes time. And that's what you really, ironically, do not have and have at the same time. So if you are working with someone else, you have to divide up the tasks. As I said, you really don't need much. A notebook, you could use an electronic folder for your project rather than a notebook. It depends on your preferences. A small notebook for personal information on the informants. You need to collect cultural artifacts, scanning, taking pictures of the work they do. For instance, if you are looking at socialization into writing, for me, it was crucial to get samples of students' writing, those who had elegant handwriting and those who didn't. Now, of course, I interviewed the teachers and also the students. One thing that really is enduring, an enduring memory in my mind. I asked one of the children, I interviewed them both separately and collectively, what do you consider bad handwriting? Now, they had already learned how to write in English as well, so this was in a multilingual, bilingual environment, but they were learning Persian separately from English that they had already acquired. And this child basically said, you erase what you write so much that you end up with a hole in the middle of your paper. And I thought that was really a perfect description. You know, total erasure is when the handwriting is terrible, ungainly. But I needed copies. You know, then I didn't have a cell phone with a tiny scanner. So I would borrow or make copies or just take a photograph using a camcorder. I'm not 200 years old, by the way. Nor are the Iranian immigrants so old. They are more recent in Los Angeles. So that's how I compiled samples, because these samples could serve as data, text, images, videos, audios, transcriptions, all these things that we will talk about. So now certain things are important, you know, charging your cell phone, or if you are allowed to record, testing the level of what is being recorded. If it is videotaping, you are able to see, you know, sometimes, for instance, I activate the recording, but in the process, I may accidentally just stop recording. These things basically happen. So what to record initially, if you are lucky to be allowed to observe, to take notes or whatever, you're not really sure what your focus or your research question is. So you can record anything and everything as long as you can. Once you establish a pattern based on your knowledge of the site and its particular activities, and you focus, zero in on a particular question, then you could only record or take notes or make notes of that particular activity. And that is how you're going to base your interview, basically, questions. So you want to take notes on the interactions in terms of beginning, transitions, and termination. If you are lucky to be able to record, you still have to take notes. Each one has a totally different function. So it is important to know what the context is. If your notes are messy and chaotic as mine, you have to go back to your notes immediately. Now, typing it up definitely offers some relief from ambiguity, but definitely when you are typing up things in haste, if you go back to your notes, that may not really make sense. But if you immediately go back, you can fill in the voids before your memory fades about the context and what notes basically you took. The ethnographic eye talks about note-taking and note-making. Those notes are crucial to your interpretation. They are crucial to your analysis. So after the observation, you need to make a copy of the original. You have to really view it, listen, watch, go back to your notes, date it, and transcribe the sections that you need for analysis. I know that most of you do not know how to transcribe. In one of these workshops, we'll talk about transcribing, which is not fun for most people, but that is the only way to really uncover the mystery and the complexity of natural human interaction and its nuances. Any questions?
Are we gonna send you the recordings?
Okay, that's a good question. You're going to use the transcription of the recording in your second observation, and definitely in your first draft of the paper and the final draft. The actual video or audio could be used in the final presentation of your project. In other words, I will only see that when you do a transcription exercise for your second observation, but eventually I would be more interested in your incorporating and integrating a short segment into your project presentation at the end of the course.
I have one last question. What if the professor they don't let us like record? What can we do with that? Like,
does anyone have any solutions? So, you know, those situations basically arise and they are problematic because ethnography without transcription becomes really difficult, if not impossible. But you have to find ways of capturing typical interactions or exchanges instructional basically exchanges, taking notes, for instance, could be a solution to that problem. And definitely your interviews have to be more in depth. Any other questions?
So during our observation, we would just like record like a typical interaction, and then we would add that into our final paper?
Initially, yes, if you can capture any interaction. So these are simply interactional or instructional. And sometimes you cannot even separate, the two. But there is a transition from one to the other, but they always overlap as well. So once you focus on a particular area, such as, for instance, socialization into math or reading or writing, or let's say martial arts, then your recording would be focused on that recurrent, typical activity that you're observing. And based on which, basically, you have a research question. Any other questions?
So that recording of an interaction, that won't be until our second observation, right?
Exactly. But the crucial thing is, as a matter of fact, that you develop a research question between the first and the second observation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to write the second observation, because the second observation is a partial interpretation or response to your research question.
I think I'm just a little confused on the on like what we need to like clearly, like what we need to observe, like
What is your site?
how Heather said it, like for example, teacher and student interaction, or like how many like I know like Americans, but like do you want us to be specific? Like there's Hispanics, Filipinos, kind of like Asians, do you want us to be like more in depth with that, or just like be more like general? Do you get me?
Okay, so I see what your basic question is. Your question is not specific. Why? Because you don't know what you are going to be focusing on. At this point, as I said, it may be premature. It is not my choice what you are going to be observing. I could guide you through the process, but you're going to be doing the observations. You're going to figure out basically what is an interesting question to focus on. And as I said, given the limited scope of this kind of work that you're going to do, which is not really genuine ethnography, let's call it quasi-ethnography, then focus on activities, a particular activity, whatever that activity is. That would become the foundation on which you develop a research question. So let me ask you, what activities, if any, have you observed so far?
Well, in my Zoom class, we do meditation. We do like Zoom group games.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before you proceed, sorry for the interruption, you could simply just say, how this particular community are socialized into meditation through Zoom. So, this is an interesting question itself. Socialization into meditation.
Oh, okay.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
It's a very broad question, and you will stay more focused.
Okay.
Now, if in the process you can sharpen your focus, so much the better. But I would always begin with a broad question. For me, it was socialization into reading and writing Persian. And then it became socialization into writing. And then I realized, oh, that is still broad. It became socialization into penmanship or elegant handwriting.
And you want us to interview the professor, right? Like the professor?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. So the interview, I'll talk about ethnographic interviews next time when we talk about the second observation. What types of questions to ask, but most of the questions should be focused on not the background, that is important, but on your research question. You know, norms, values that are taught through, for instance, Zoom with respect to meditation. What transformations have taken place? What are the challenges of teaching people how to meditate, you know, when it comes to Zoom, when, you know, their identities are quite different from, or the instructor's identity may be different as well. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
So I know you said like you keep referring to as our second observation, but I know you said we do 4 total observations. So is it like, I know like our first observation you said it's like more like kind of like general and just like what this, you know, what we're observing is and stuff, and this like second observation is more like focused on our research question. So are the other 2 observations we have to complete like kind of like the same thing, like we're just observing to help answer our research question?
What else do you want to do? I mean, that's quite an accomplishment, answering your research question, right? But the problem is, as you will find out, is to be able to gather sufficient data to answer your question. And sometimes you have sufficient data, but it doesn't answer your research question. Then you may find yourself changing your research question. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, it's just like the other, like, altogether all the observations are just help us collect data.
Right.
And then you were also saying, so when we do the interview, that's like more of the, like, if it's like a class, like with the professor, we could like kind of ask them like questions that like help to answer our research questions.
Yeah, definitely. You know, there would be clarification questions, for instance, why they did what they did, how they did it. If you're not sure about what you observed, you could ask for explanations. You know, there would be different types of questions. And that's what ethnographic interviews are. Again, we are using multiple resources such as note-taking, audio taping, videotaping, transcription for that purpose, cultural artifacts. All these would be used in interviews to triangulate the data that we have and the analysis that we want to produce. Rather than using just one source, we use multiple sources.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so do we still have time? Don't tell me no. Are we out of time?
I think we still have time.
Okay, let me go over this as well. Share very quickly. So we talked about really traditional ethnography that is longitudinal. Do you see my screen, by the way? You should. direct observations and collection of data on spatial, the space, temporal, the timing, interactional, and instructional dimensions. So rather than being uniform and singular in orientation, ethnography and methods are varied depending on circumstances. So the reorientation is this: because of the imposition of these new circumstances, we are shifting to digital or virtual ethnography, and this orientation can still draw on the first and second observations that you will modify technologically and also in terms of methods of observation. So it occurs willy-nilly in light of no explicit guidelines. So if the overall picture is still murky and ambiguous for you, do not really panic. The magnitude of the work becomes clear to you as the project unfolds. So don't feel that you have been left behind. So we use digital technology, as I said, our cell phones is a very good example, and the ways in which it combines so many functions: tactile, digital, textual, visual, you just name it. Of course, this miraculous technology also that we carry with us wherever we go, everyone knows everything about us, especially those who are not supposed to know much. They know everything about us. So our transition to digital ethnography is a must, is a necessity, and it is to augment basically the quality of the work that we do. So how could we use this? We were just talking about ethnographic interviews. Now, some of you may find out that you need to use questionnaires, surveys for a particular class that you are observing, that, for instance, you can send out emails, or you can ask some potential participants, for instance, to be interviewed on and through Zoom or Skype remotely. So even though, as I was saying in the beginning, you are not or you are not really using typical ethnography as it was customary in the past, but you could apply the new technology to the methods of your observation. Now, some of you are already a member of a group, or you have a role as a participant observer in the community that you're observing. That is both a virtue and a vice. A virtue, why? Because you are a member of that community. You have an emic perspective. It's a vice because as a member of that community, you have emic perspective, but the etic perspective may prove to be problematic because you cannot distance yourself from the group, or you have a dual role. You have a conflict of roles as a participant, as an observer. How can you basically compromise and reconcile, these conflicting roles? That would be problematic to some extent. So I would assume that, and that is what most of you have said, you're observing online communities. And the crucial thing is that these communities are going through a transition themselves, as we are going through this kind of transition. Not only in the mode of communication that they have, but also in the ways in which any kind of teaching, training, learning, or education, formal or informal, basically takes place. Any questions? Okay, so I will make this recording available. I know that you had some of the materials, but the benefit of the workshop is not just the lectures, but specific questions that you have in the context of what you are going to be doing or what you have already done or what you intend to do. So in that sense, someone had commented if I have these on Beachboard. Yes, I do. But definitely, I'm not addressing those specific questions of you in particular. And that's what makes the workshop basically different. And in the future, there will be more, hopefully, interaction about the kind of work that you're doing. And looking forward to your projects and successful completion.
I have a question regarding
Yes.
the midterm. I know it's on the syllabus, it says October 8th, and then I was reading the requirements for the midterm, and it says that like we have, as students, we have to formulate questions. What
Right.
exactly do you mean by
So, again, you know, I had to write down basically a specific date, but as I said, there is a degree of flexibility when it comes to your ethnography. Why? Because its planning really does not depend on you, especially those who are not lucky enough to be given consent. So definitely let me know there is flexibility. So some of you had not found a site and you had been, for instance, asked to respond to a couple of questions or have those questions in mind before you do a particular homework. So as I said, there is a degree of flexibility when it comes to the ethnography.
So you think we should just focus on the ethnography project
Right.
instead of the midterm? We'll figure out the midterm.
The midterm, we will talk about you're talking about the midterm exam?
Yeah, because I was just looking at the syllabus and then I was looking under midterms on the syllabus and it was saying that we have to formulate questions.
Yes.
Posted
Yeah.
on Beachboard, so I was just like confused.
Okay, so that was basically a misunderstanding on my part. You will have a midterm when you finish preschool and 3 cultures, and if I recall correctly, yeah, by the end of preschool and 3 cultures, you would formulate basically questions per groups and contribute to essay type questions on Beachboard. And then I will pick a number of those questions that you will have still some options, and that would become the basis of your midterm. And obviously it is take home, it's remote. So traditionally, I asked students to formulate questions. That was part of the exam itself. And then I will go from the pool of questions that the students have provided. I will accept, synthesize some of those questions, reject the other ones, and that would become your midterm. So that's what it means. I have to go back to the syllabus. The bi-weekly schedule will be posted by or on Sunday. So those expectations would be made more transparent.
Okay, thank you.
Can I change my site? Because I had a different one, but I think I'm gonna do a different one. Can I do that?
Yes, you could.
Okay, thank you.
If a situation like that arises, definitely, even if you have done your first observation, it is not too late. The earlier it happens, the better. It becomes far more complicated beyond the first observation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then I could stay on if you have any questions for me? Let me stop the recording. If there are no questions, I could simply end the meeting.
So when was the due date for the first observation?
You know, I cannot perform miracles. There are so many assignments that I can't really remember those important dates. But what I do, and this is our main criterion, there's a weekly, basically a schedule we try to stick to unless we have some legitimate reason not to be able to fulfill basically those obligations. So a Sunday, I would say, of every week would be when you could submit any work which presumably is due during the week as well. And when it comes to ethnography, you could go even beyond the week.